Y bienvenidos a esta tertulia. Tonight we have a special guest. It's always a special guest, but tonight is someone that I have visited for many years at the Centro Journal, and his name is Xavier Totti, Professor Xavier Totti from Lehman. How are you, Javier?
I'm doing fine. Thank you for having me here. It's really a pleasure, and I guess it will be fun also.
I hope it is. So far, it's been wonderful. And just so our people that are watching us can know, or those of them that do not know you already, like I said, Javier is a professor of Latin American Studies at Lehman College. He has a degree, an undergraduate degree from La Universidad de Puerto Rico. He also went to the CUNY Graduate Center, where he has a master's. And he basically has been anchoring. He's been the editor of the Centro Journal of Puerto Rican Studies for the past, I don't know, 15, 18 years, like something amount of
like
time.
that.
Enough to give it an imprint,
yes.
An imprint that a lot of people are very impressed with, including yours truly. And so we want to talk about Puerto Rico, Puerto Ricans in the United States, his research. He also has some very interesting publications, some books he has been working on about Latino identity and Puerto Rican anthropology. Anyway, he will tell us all about it. Primero que nada, Javier.
Yes.
Talk to me about that last name, because before we start, my grandmother used to take me to a place called Totti, and she would buy comic books. So this is my grandmother. She is has been dead for a while, but I wanted her to be with us today because those are some of my fondest memory. Totti, who's the Italian? What's that about?
No, it's actually not Italian. It's Corsican, yes. My great-great-grandfather came from Corsica in around 1860. He came in as an indentured servant, actually. He came in to pay a debt. He was, I guess his family were small peasants in Corsica, and they owe money to a large landowner. And one of the ways that you pay the debt was to give your child so that they would work for 10 years to pay that debt. And so he came in to Puerto Rico. He traveled. He was, from what I hear from the family history, fortunately, he was a 14-year-old that was literate. He could write, so he wrote in a little notebook things. He came in, he was 14-year-old. He traveled alone from Ajiaco to Marseille, and then from Marseille to Arroyo. He entered Puerto Rico in Arroyo, and he was indentured to a Corsican by the last name of Anton Giorgi, who had a store in Arroyo. And then he also had an hacienda in Yauco. He came into the store and then worked there and then worked in the hacienda. And then after 10 years, the debt was paid and he stayed.
Oh my God. And what about do you have any relation to the people that ran that drugstore where my grandmother would take me to buy comic books when I was a child?
Yeah, all are related, a very remote relation. But yeah, they are related somehow, though I don't know them personally.
Okay. Well, that's a fascinating story of the Tottis there. Thanks for sharing. You attended the University of Puerto Rico and you studied anthropology there?
I studied anthropology at the UPR in Rio Piedras. Yes, I graduated.
Any professors, anyone that you'd like to bring up that we might know about, or that some of our viewers
I
you
studied
recall?
with, there were a number of them who were well-known anthropologists. I mean, Eugenio Fernandez Mendez, who wrote all of those cultural histories, was my professor. My mentor was Rafael Ramirez, who wrote that famous book on political organization in a Cataño slum that was used by all political parties. And of course, the distinguished Professor Carlos Buitrago, who did all that work in the highlands, etc., was also my professor.
And why anthropology? What attracted you to anthropology back as a younger student?
I know what I didn't want to be, no offense. I didn't want to be a lawyer, which everyone at that time wanted to be. So I guess I was looking for things that were not that. And I took a course with Eugenio Fernandez Mendez and fell in love with the discipline.
I see.
He was, even though what I did, except I was very different from his, but he was like a major figure in attracting people into the field.
And why New York? So obviously New York is a great destination, a big destination for so many of us. But what is your New York story? How come you decided to come and either study here or move here, work here, or somebody attracted you here? What's the story?
I'm a city person, so I always, New York had played always. I mean, I had relatives in New York and everyone on that. New York always played a big role in everything we did in Puerto Rico of the 60s. And that was a large Puerto Rican population with the New Ricans, the young lords, etc. So I wanted to live in a big city. I didn't want to go to a little town somewhere else in the United States. So New York, I always had that attraction. And by this time, I mean, I moved to New York in 1974. I have lived in Brazil for a little bit, doing field work for my doctoral dissertation, etc. But basically, I've been in New York. My children were born there. They are New Yorkers. They consider themselves New Yorkers, even though they don't live there at this moment. But that always played a big role. And I guess I'm a very urban person.
And what was that Brazilian séjour? I mean, where did you go in Brazil, and what were you doing?
We went and we lived in I got a grant from a foundation, and I was studying a local elite bourgeoisie in the northeastern part of Brazil, in the state of Paraíba. In the interior, we were in the city of Campina Grande. It's a city about 300,000 people, etc. But it's in the zone when we were there, it's in the part of Brazil. It hadn't rained in 10 years. It's that part of droughts, of big, vidas secas.
Is that Sertão? Is that considered Sertão?
It's the frontier of what is called the Zona de Agreste, which is an intermediate zone with the Sertão. It was the entrance to the Sertão. I mean, it hadn't rained in 10 years. It was rough.
Okay, so a lot of dust, mucho polvo allí.
Yes.
Oh my God. Well, and then so you land in New York, eventually make your way here. You study at the Graduate Center, which is such a crown jewel of the CUNY, right? Of the
Yes.
CUNY University. And how did you? When did you discover Centro, or how, and because you are, like we said, the editor of the Centro Journal. How do you come about Centro?
Centro. I discovered Centro early on in 1973, 74 when it was founded. Rafael Ramirez, who was an anthropologist that was my mentor here in Puerto Rico, he ran this is part of that whole movement in Puerto Rico. He was part of the left of the Puerto Rican Independence Party at that time, the left wing, the so-called terceristas, etc. And he ran for the assembly in Puerto Rico and lost. And the party had a purge of all the leftists. They were all kicked out. And it was really an ugly situation with a lot of slander and innuendo, etc. And he was kicked out. And I guess Rafa was having sort of like a crisis, and he knew Fran Bonilla from Boston, when they were both students there, etc. And Frank had just been brought over from California to start Centro. So Frank invited him as a researcher to Centro in '73, the year Centro is born, when it was on 42nd and 5th, diagonally across from New York Public Library. That's where Centro began. So I moved to New York, and so I went to Centro from at the very beginning. And then, of course, when they moved, like a couple of years later, 2-3 years later, they moved to John Jay College. I used their library, etc. I went to meetings there, etc. So I've always been, since I moved to New York in '74, I've always been in one relationship or another with Centro, mostly informal, no, and attending things, etc.
So it was very organic because of your connections in Puerto Rico.
As an academic, etc., and a student, you will go to the library, and you know, Amilcar Tirado was the librarian, and Amilcar, it was fantastic to go there and talk to him. You always felt welcome and having conversations with him.
Right, a kinship, a certain warmth and kinship. Yes,
exactly.
Well, I caught the last end of the last of the old guard, as it were. Frank Bonilla was in his way, was just out, and there was like a new thing going on. But anyway, you have mentioned, you have said that, and I like this quote: all journals are born out of a struggle. Okay. Yes. So what were the particular challenges that El Centro overcame to become this very important, hub for ethnic studies, most notably our Puerto Rican studies, and what is that, what struggle is addressed and continues to be addressed, as it were, in the Centro Journal?
Yeah, no, sure, and you're right. I mean, all journals are born out of groups of people that want to say something, and they don't let them say it. So they move and form a vehicle on which they can publish. Many of these vehicles cease to exist 1 year later or 2 years later, etc. Centro Journal has been in existence since '87. There was a need. Academic journals in the United States were not publishing things by Puerto Rican academics and were not interested in Puerto Rican issues. Sociology journals, anthropology, literature journals, etc. By the same token, journals in Puerto Rico were not interested about issues that dealt with the diaspora. They, are not Puerto Rican, it's not what we do, etc. So there was this void, this necessity to have this research, this inquietudes, this settling, this thing, creativity to channel it. And the history of Centro Journal, there are two people that have to be mentioned. One of them is the first editor, who is Blanca Vasquez, who was really the first editor who started the journal. And
that's Blanca, when I arrived. I remember Blanca, and then I remember also Juan Flores was around, and then Miriam. And that was later, the group that I met when I got close to Centro.
So Blanca Vasquez. Blanca had the vision to create a journal that was more open to community and to everything academic, but more open to the community. And there was another person. He has since passed away. He was an administrator. He eventually became the CUNY's vice chancellor for finance, but he was an administrator within the finance division, a Boricua named Ernesto Malave. And Malave unfortunately passed away like 10 years ago as a young person, but Malave was instrumental in saying and reserving money, saying, yes, this is necessary, this is important, and I'm going to take a little bit of money from CUNY here, and I'm going to put it in this so that this journal runs.
So he made the bet. He's the one that made the bet.
And he only made the bet. He put the bacon there.
Right.
And he was always a supporter of the journal. And that's what allows the journal, which begins really, if you look at the first issues, they are mimeograph copies, with the paper folded and stapled. They're very primitive, and they basically tell stories about what's the research that researchers at Centro are doing. They might have like a historical note on someone and stuff like that. And by 1987, it becomes a perfect bound journal. Blanca tries to copy two other journals that were important and tries to make it similar to that. One of them was a journal that came out of Chicago called the Rican by a sociologist named Samuel Betances. And it's probably the first academic journal, I might be wrong, but it's probably the first academic journal of Puerto Ricans in the United States. The Rican comes out around from 74 to 79. Samuel Betances, who was a professor at University of Illinois, Chicago, and Ricardo Fernandez, who later became president of Lehman, but was a professor at the University of Wisconsin, Milwaukee, are the editors. And the Rican had like poetry and academic articles, some art, etc. It was a mixture. And the other journal she copies is the Black Scholar, which had the same mixture. So those were her inspirations for it.
Well, and I think she hit the nail on the head, because one of the it is an intoxicating mix. I know that as a young artist, I was I remember seeing photos of Rafael Cortijo, nice spreads. Juan Sanchez had some amazing covers.
Nestor Otero was the graphic designer of the journal.
And it was so beautiful. I saw something that was very attractive and that I would cut and paste stuff. And I haven't seen the original, so I've got to ask Pedro Juan one day to show me the first ones, because I'm not familiar with them.
The first are mimeograph copies, that you did on a dito sheet, etc., and they are folded and stapled. Very primitive, but it is out of that it grows. They publish like 2 or 3 like that, and then when Malavé comes in and says, this is crap. You have to publish something decent, and he gives the money.
And it's a very that inception, like the mutually exclusive things, right? You're talking about our migration here, excluded from the academic journals in Puerto Rico, and you also talk about the exclusion of any writing by our academics here, not being picked up by the mainstream journal. So
yes.
And going back to that struggle, so you're to your quote, all journals are born out of a struggle. So how, and this is a very broad question, how has that struggle changed? I mean, can we periodize it by decades since your arrival in the 70s? And where is it at today? If you can articulate a little bit of how that struggle, the signpost keeps changing, and we keep changing with it. And I have seen Centro Journal also adapt, evolve, and sort of, become different.
Today there are more avenues with ethnic studies and Latinx studies or Latino studies out there, and there are more journals. But there's still that feeling that every group wants to tell her story, its story, and there's that feeling that this is our story and it has to be told. And so I guess you still need a vehicle that will exclusively tell that story. That doesn't mean that you can go and tell that story in another place or do it comparatively. In terms of the journal, by the mid-1990s, there is a shift. There are more Puerto Rican academics. There are more Puerto Rican academics that are trying to publish, because if they don't publish, they perish. They're not given whatever tenure, etc. And the journal was too general. It was not an academic journal. So there begins this struggle within the Puerto Rican academic group, at what to do. Is this exclusively for the community, or this is for academics? But if I publish there, and if I'm an academic, a historian, or a literature person, I publish literary critique in Centro Journal, the committee in my university will say,
no me lo cuentan, no
this
cuentan.
is crap, no me lo cuentan. So there begins, and Juan Flores is the one who begins to push so that the journal becomes more, quote unquote, professional academic. And that the articles are sent to peer reviewers, to anonymous peer reviewers, so that to institute that process of review. And by 1998, etc., you mentioned here, Miriam Jimenez substitutes Blanca Vasquez as the editor of the journal. And Miriam is the one who first institutes the peer review process. And the journal begins to have a board of editors, an editorial board, I'm sorry, that is from academics, by Puerto Rican academics who are throughout the United States. So the board is not internal to Centro. It's not people in Centro who are deciding this should be published, it shouldn't, etc. And so that's like the first change with Miriam, and it becomes more professional. I come in 2001, actually, so it's 20 years. My gray hair shows.
Should we play the tango? ¿Quiere que pongamos el tango?
20 años no son nada.
Un soplo la vida.
And I continue that process that Miriam started. I continue it by solidifying the peer review, making it all that, and also by having the journal being picked up by abstract and abstract services that take the journal and tell librarians and academics, this is what has been published in this journal, and eventually pick up the journal electronically and sell it to the libraries.
So the diffusion. So we start
diffusion. We begin to diffuse, exactly, to reach wider and wider audiences. Today, for example, the journal is carried electronically by 4 services, 4 corporations that distribute things to libraries, etc. And the journal articles are downloaded on an average of 75,000 a year.
So, and what to have a comparative, right? Because when we were starting, before we got on the actual interview, you were asking me, well, who sees the Tertulia? I told you it's a modest thing. We go from 50 to 150. When Nitza Tufino came, we had 500 people. But anyway, but that's Nitza. So 75,000, it seems like an incredible amount of people to me. So what would a journal from Harvard or something really like high octane academic, how many people do see?
No, they will, for example, the American Sociological Review has more than 500,000.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Okay. But still, I mean, before we were published, and we published what, 500, and that went to libraries. Now it's electronic. We also publish in book, no, but it diffuses, and you see people in Japan downloading articles because you can see from where they're downloading. In France or in Spain or South Africa or Chile downloading articles. So it gives a reach to our topics.
Oh no, absolutely. No, I'm very impressed, and I would like to press you. What would be a success the download? What has been perhaps, I mean, or something, I mean, perhaps not the most successful, but something that you remember, Diablo, and they keep downloading this one. Is there something like that has been like very downloadable? Author?
It's interesting because it's mixed things. We have, early on when I became editor, we did a special issue on Mayra Santos Febre's novel Sirena Selena. It had been published more or less, a few years before. And those articles are downloaded an incredible amount constantly.
The ones about Mayra Santos' novel.
Yes, and this is what, 20 years later. They're still downloaded. On my first issue, was on a special issue on the Puerto Rican community in Chicago. And there are 2 articles there, one by Nilda Flores on the sociological analysis of Paseo Boricua, where the flags are.
Humboldt Park
and the Puerto Rican stores are. That article is like cited and downloaded still a lot by urban planners, people in urban planners and etc. And in that issue, there was another article by Merida Rua, who is an anthropologist who's now at Northwestern. And Merida, the title of the article is Colao Identity. It's about, she is half Mexican, half Puerto Rican. It's about that, about the children of Puerto Rican and
Body mix. We have a name for that at the Clemente. That's the body mix.
Body mix of the body mix. And it's a really interesting article, a little bit autobiographical, but also very anthropological. And that article is like still 20 years later, it's a monumental hit.
Talking about hyphenation and body mix, and so what are other groups or articles that deal with intersectionality in the Caribbean, or in this case, Mexico? You just mentioned a great example with the Ruba, right?
Yes.
With Ruba's article of, you know, Boricua Mexican. What are other groups that we have addressed or that have addressed us and which have been reflected in the journal that you can remember, or the more prominent or common ones?
We did a special issue, a special section of a journal on Puerto Rican Dominican relations and Mangu, Mofongo, etc. And that
when was this?
When
When was this one?
This is like 5 years ago, 6 years ago. And it's still popular. You know, articles also that we have popular, we have an article on housing segregation by William Velez that is really popular. It's used a lot by sociologists on the segregation of Puerto Ricans in different cities. So it varies. Our issue in 2017, we did a special issue on 100 years of the Jones Act that gave us imposed the citizenship. And that's a big issue. It was edited by Charles Venator Santiago and Edgardo Melendez, and that's a big popular issue.
Yeah, well, it's a heavy subject. It's a lot of baggage.
Subject.
A lot of baggage. Now, how much work? I mean, like I said, in my master's days, I would go. I remember seeing you there. You used to joke because I would go pick up my check even after electronic transfer, and you'd say, "Well, you're a guy that picks up his check." I'm like, "Yeah, well," and it was a great excuse to go by Centro to check out, you know, some folks, and you being one of them. How much work and how much work goes into putting together an issue? If you could give us a very brief, like, what's the process when you do you come up with the topic? Do people give you the topic? We now know that you do this peer reviews, or I mean, it's well known. We just talked about it in the interview anyway. But you know, how do you put it together?
Both. I sometimes come with an idea about, hey, you know, because you read what's around, and let's do a special issue on Dominican Puerto Rican. Let's do a special issue on Chicago. But also people come to you with ideas about special issues. So it works both ways. And I listen to everyone who comes up with an idea. I don't turn any idea out. I generally run with them. Sometimes we don't. It doesn't pan out, but other times it does. You know, the work of an editor. I was once in a conference. There were a group of editors of different journals, Lourdes Torres of Latino Studies, Charlene Black of Aztlán, and Nick Canelos, who is the editor of, who's half Puerto Rican, half Greek. He's the editor of Arte Público Press, out of the University of Mexico. Nick was there, and he used to run, Arte Público used to have a journal called the Americas Review. And he dropped it, and he said, you know, I dropped the journal, I went into book publishing, which is the major Latino press in the United States. Because in a journal, all you do is write letters. The correspondence is too much, and it's true. That's all you're constantly writing letters to readers, to authors. So my day, it takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of time and effort to contact possible authors, to trying to bring them in. To bring them into your vision, or to reflect their vision broadly? To reflect their vision. No, I don't impose. My vision is, I let the guest editors or the authors come in with their ideas. I don't try to say, this is the line of the journal and you have to follow it. We're very eclectic, and I think that's been part of the success of why we're moving.
But have there been issues that have been quote unquote yours, meaning that you have actually handled those duties and it's not guest edited, or
well, even if it's a guest editor, I handle everything, the correspondence, everything. Yes.
And I was thinking about what you were mentioning about Arte Público Press, and besides being the editor of the journal, you also have your own books, and I wanted to touch on one of them, something you co-authored with Felix Mato, Puerto Ricans in America, 30 years of activism and changes, new directions in Latino American culture. If you could, talk to us a little bit about that book, because it's compelling.
That was a special issue of the journal.
Okay.
And I wanted to do, and so did Felix at the time, Felix Matos, who's now the chancellor of CUNY. At the time, he was the director of, as you remember, of Centro. And we wanted to do something on 1969 and the activism of that period. And so we did a special issue and went about, getting different aspects of that. I mean, there's an excellent, we got Lilian Jimenez to write and publish these monumentally interesting interviews with the Puerto Rican student activists at City College during the takeover and of City College in '69 that led to the establishment of ethnic studies, etc. And it's fascinating interview with like 6 activists from the period. We have Nelida Perez did one on the establishment of Centro Library and Archives and what it took. Pedro Caban did another on the conceptualization of Puerto Rican studies. And so on and so forth. We had an article on the Young Lords, on El Comité, etc. It was really fun because it was so interesting. Very little had been written at the time. And you were also dealing with a lot of authors who had a lot of passion and wanted to tell these stories.
And those stories are kind of the moment, right, of the ethnic studies, like you say.
Absolutely, yes.
And they take they've been regurgitated and talked about, and we keep going back, perhaps because we find that we are not standing up to muster now. I mean, how do you see, since we're on that subject, and there was that issue of, sorry, I thought it was a book, but it was an issue that it's kind of like a book issue. Because those are like, it's a book. What do you, how do you feel about the comparison between that activism, the 60s, that zeitgeist moment, and then now, and the activism now? Because you have devoted some time and effort to that topic yourself.
Well, ethnic studies in America, it's always flourishing and always under threat. It's both things. On the one hand, there is the push for the mosaic and for plurality, etc. And at this moment, ethnic studies I guess it would be almost its zenith, though it probably will go higher, in the sense that there is a lot of production, a lot of people who have dedicated their time and are writing and thinking about it. And there are a lot of journals also publishing. And there is a general acceptance in many universities of the need for plurality, etc. But by the same token, ethnic studies are always under threat. There's always someone with a knife about to put it on your throat and say that you're not significant, that you're dividing the country.
Well, that's the sense I get right now, that it's like impending doom, or I don't know if I'm accurate on my reading, but it seems like all the gains, especially Puerto Rico and Puerto Ricans gains, which we have been at the forefront, along with the Chicanos, especially the Chicanos first, perhaps a second, it doesn't matter. We've been at the forefront. It seems like a lot of these might just vanish, or that's a sense sometimes I get currently going forward. Because there is a retrenchment in academia, or apparently there may be. Tenure is under attack. All these things are going, the budgets of academia are becoming increasingly suspect and unsustainable. So I get a sense that it's
and the liberal arts are under attack from people who want just the technical careers or the sciences, etc. Yes, I mean, I think that fear has always been there from the beginning. So we go through periods when everyone is sort of like, okay, and there's no threat, and then all of a sudden there is a budget crunch, and there's always the fear that because ethnic studies is in the humanities, social sciences, that is going to be chopped in addition to, you know, we Puerto Ricans are not the only game in town. There are many other Latinos, and we're, so everyone wants a stake, and rightfully so, by the way. But you don't give someone by taking from another. The powers that be have to bring the resources to it, no? So yeah, there is always, I mean, I've been in the department at Lehman College since '87, and we have gone through major crises, and there is, I remember when there was retrenchment in 1992, and there was a fear that we were going to be eliminated, and it was everyone for him or herself. Departments were saying, well, don't cut history or Spanish, don't cut me, cut them. Why do you need Latino studies? What do you need Puerto Rican studies? So, and that was 92, and the department is still alive. So yes, there's that fear, but I think there's also, we also have the capacity to mobilize to defend. And that cannot be underestimated.
Yes, yes. But I find it very interesting that it's kind of a perennial situation. So that that it's always al filo de la navaja, no? Right there, there's
you sometimes get the feeling that they let you, you know, they let you have that little corner there, which happened in ethnic studies at CUNY for many years. It happened. You had that corner there, and that's it. But then you had other people, Latinos within the system, like Ernesto Malave, who said, no, 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 no. You can't have a mimeograph, a dito page staple. That's not a journal. Right. You know, I'm going to give the resource. So there's always that. There are always groups or people that move in and contribute. But the fear has always been there. And now in the United States, you know, with our past president and all of the hatred and ugly things that he regurgitated out and threw out there on the streets. So yeah, there is that.
There is some tension, fear. A lot, or has been a lot of tension.
And in addition to that, you have the feeling that people should study things that you can get a job immediately, that you can be a computer technician, you can be a computer programmer, or you can be a nurse. Why study literature? Why study arts, etc.? So you have that.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and that's perennial. That's always been in academia.
Perennial. We go through like cycles.
Regardless of ethnic studies, you know, and such. But, you know, going to the, you know, the powers that be and the allotment of resources and visionaries like Malave, it seems to me that on the past few years, there has been, or Centro has pursued some sort of track in empowering itself with a very active, proactive publishing books that look like the Centro Journal, but they're actually books, or not the journal,
yes.
but books.
Under the past director, or he's still the director, but he's leaving the directorship in July. But Edwin Melendez, we started a press. It took a lot of effort because CUNY didn't want us to have an imprint, a press. It was in the hands of lawyers for like 3 years, Miguel. I don't lie.
Wow.
In the meantime, I meet one day with people at the CUNY School of Journalism, and the guy tells me, oh, I'm the editor of the CUNY School of Journalism press, and we didn't ask for permission for anyone. So it was like, you know, these blancos are this, why can't we have it? So we used that to push it through. We said, well, you know, the School of Journalism didn't ask permission, and they have a press, and they have published this book, so we have to. So we started publishing books. The initial idea, the first book we published was by Lisa Sanchez Gonzalez, and it was Centro. The archives have the collection of Pura Belpré, all of her stories, her children's stories, some of them which are unpublished, but they have everything. So the first book we published was basically going into the Centro archives and bringing out Pura Belpré out.
In that sense, the synergy is just unbeatable. You can't beat that kind of synergy. You know, it's incredible.
Yes. And then Centro was getting the collection of Gilberto Gerena Valentino, the famous
I saw that book.
Puerto Rican civil rights leader. And so Centro hires actually a historian to interview Gerena so Gerena could write his memoirs and to corroborate everything that Gerena says. And we published the Gerena Valentin memoirs, and that also has been a monumental hit because this is the early struggles of the Puerto Rican. Gerena went to New York in 1938, 39. The early struggles, and went into unions immediately. The early struggle of the labor movement and Puerto Ricans in the labor movement, and the fight for civil rights. You know, and we find out, for example, that Gerena led a contingent of like 600 Puerto Ricans to the Poor People March in Washington, the Martin Luther King, and you know, all of that comes up. So it was fascinating, contributing to that story. And
are those under your purview as well as
yes, as editor? I'm the editor of Centro Publications. It's a lot of work.
Wow.
We have published like 18 books. We've published a book on liberalism and the Puerto Rican community and politics.
That's Jose Cruz.
Jose Cruz's book on Puerto Rican organizations in the 60s and 50s and how they play the Democratic Party, etc., to get more things. We now
what about the one about the playwright? What is it?
Victor Fragoso.
Yeah,
that's a very interesting story. Victor Fragoso is a seminal figure in the New York theater world of the 70s and 80s. He unfortunately dies very young of AIDS. He was one of also the first professors at Puerto Rican Studies in Rutgers. And all of his papers, his family had here in Puerto Rico. And one of his nieces meets Edwin Melendez somewhere, and they're talking, and says, look, I have all of these things, all of his papers, etc. And he says, what? You know, bring them over, we'll take them. And it has all of his plays, and some of them who had never been published or performed. So we found an academic, Consuelo Martinez, who's now in Australia, to put them together and write a strong introduction, and we publish all of the Victor Fragoso plays.
Oh my God. And I also...
And that collection is in Centro archives also.
So again, like exploiting that unique synergy that can only come about from having direct access to all the documents of you know, Puerto Ricans, our diaspora.
Yes. Well, and you're going to interview, I think, Pedro Juan Hernandez, who is a senior archivist. I mean, the Centro archives are the jewel, really, of the crown of New York crown. It's one of the jewels in New York's crown, not only Puerto Rican. I mean, this is a major
and especially CUNY, and especially for
CUNY, absolutely,
like CUNY, definitely.
Absolutely. This is, you know, these are amazing archives, and I believe they're the largest Latino archives in the United States. This is a serious collection. We also published recently a book on Puerto Rican revolutionaries.
The Patria. I'm interested in that one because that's a very, just like you were mentioned about the 60s, there's this other moment a long time ago in this late 1800s where not just the Puerto Ricans, but the Cubans and everybody was hanging out here, sometimes in the Lower East Side, sometimes in El Barrio.
In Lower Manhattan, yes. Patria, Patria was the newspaper of the Cuban Revolutionary Party who was fighting to break Cuba away from Spain.
But a Puerto Rican would print it. I think it was a Puerto Rican
Sotero
printer.
Figueroa was the editor and printer. The editor was Jose Martí. Sotero Figueroa had the press, Imprenta America, I think it was. It was somewhere around Duane Street in downtown Manhattan, and he would print it. And Patria published, had also with the Puerto Rican section of the Cuban Revolutionary Party, the House of Puerto Ricans, publishing Patria. So what Edgardo Melendez, the author, did is that he takes all of the articles in Patria that deal with Puerto Rico, written by Martí, by Sotero Figueroa, by Estrada Palma, by everyone, and brings them together. We translate it, and then Edgardo Melendez does like 5 chapters of the life of what was the life of Cubans and Puerto Ricans in the New York of the 1890s. Their clubs, their stores, what were the debates, where did they go to entertain, etc. It's really an interesting book, and it sort of like throws a history that, very few people, it's forgotten.
Well, yeah, and it's one of the most important ones, but by being so far away, so long ago rather, it really has become, scarce, as it were.
Scarce, exactly.
Yeah, scarce. But let's, all this work is making me, thirsty. But besides that,
let me drink something also.
I want to, just ask you now a little bit more about, you said from an early age, you kept hearing about New York. As a Puerto Rican, you're aware of New York, you gravitate towards this. You've obviously been immensely engaged in our Puerto Rican thing. And so what does Xavier Totti and his family, your wife, I mean, your kids, you mentioned, they're proud about being New Yorkers. But especially you, what is your routine, your art? Did you used to hang out at the New Yorican? No, I was more Taller Boricua, or no, I actually went to the limelight. I don't know what your passion or your arts, if any, are.
Used to go to El Corso.
El Corso, I don't know about El Corso. What is El Corso?
El Corso was a salsa club on Lex and 86.
Okay, and when was
on the
this?
Second floor?
when was El Corso active?
In the 70s. I lived for many years on 15th Street by 6, so I used to go a lot to Loisaida and to the Eureka, etc. Right now, I live in Hell's Kitchen.
So you used to go to La Taza de Oro, perhaps?
I used to go to La Taza de Oro on 8th Avenue between 14 and 15. Absolutely. I used to go to La Taza de Oro and also to Michinita, the Cuban Chinese next door to La Taza de Oro. So you alternated. And Casa Monet on 14th Street when it was alive, that famous
and we had
store.
the bookstores, which we have lost. Estaba Macondo,
Lectorum, absolutely. With Jorge. Jorge was the owner of Macondo, was a dear friend. So,
where is he from? He's Colombian?
Colombian, but married to a Puerto Rican.
Yeah, something I remember.
From Caguas. He lived for a while. He was living here in Caguas in Puerto Rico. So I became fascinated with New York and with city life. I grew up in Roosevelt, in Atorrey, but that's not a city, though it was fun. No.
Hey, we got one of the last independent cinema in all of Puerto Rico, and it's an incredible place. So don't put it down.
And Roosevelt has its own plaza, and they have fiestas patronales. It's like a barrio of San Juan that believes it's a town.
Well, there used to be a Tasty Freeze also.
There used to be a Tasty Freeze there, yes, on Domenech and Hostos, yes.
But there's a change, right? You come here and it's like.
Yes, but I mean, this is the glory years of New York. The 70s were the glory years of New Yorican life in New York. I mean, the height. So it was a great experience, and I fell into it immediately.
And now you Lehman, Centro Journal, New York, San Juan. Where else, Javier? Because I know you also, you know, maybe go elsewhere. I like to, you know, I myself have been going a lot to China. I'm a student of Chinese culture and art, and so that's my third place. So what
Uh-huh.
would be your third place if you have one?
Well, yeah, you know, family pulls you. I have I have two children. My oldest daughter lives in France. She married a French guy and lives there. So have four grandkids. So
In Paris or somewhere
In
in
Paris,
Paris?
in Paris. He has a business there and has a restaurant, whatever. We go a lot to Paris to be with the family.
Well,
Uh,
but for a lover of cities, it could have been
I
a
know,
lot worse.
absolutely.
That's very
And
nice.
I still come to Puerto Rico a lot. My parents are deceased now, but I still come to Puerto Rico a lot and find, you know, I like that familiarity, that outgoingness, etc. But I always want to return to New York.
Es
Uh,
como un vicio. Esto es como un vicio
no,
aquí.
when I moved to New York, this Puerto Rican, this New Rican guy tells me, Nueva York te daña. It's true.
Well, talking about daño, and to sort of start, you know, winding down. Let's talk a little bit about the elephant in the China closet, our COVID, our COVID era, and how has that, you know, how is that affecting you as the publisher of the Centro Journal? You know, and let's finish a little bit and with some words of hope at the end, please. But talk to us a little bit about the
Well, you
COVID.
know, with the lockdown, the universities under lockdown, and most universities are, so everything takes longer. And I find that reviewers contacting people, everything takes longer because I guess people get so much input from the computer that they push it aside. Um, Hardly use the phone anymore. Everything is email or Zoom, etc. So that's a reality. The journal has continued to be published, and the press continues. You know, we have been coming out. The journal 3 years ago, we started being published. We used to be published twice a year. Now we're published 3 times a year, which is better. So we
Well,
have
that's
kept.
a feat. How did you manage that? I
And
mean, in
it's
the
a lot
middle,
of work. It's like I
yeah.
don't know what I should have said. No, let's keep 2.
Or let's go down to 1, you know, like whatever.
No, I can't be lazy. But that's hard. But it's interesting. Um, you also get people contacting. I get people contacting me for special issues. We have
You
now
did one on the recuperation of Puerto Rico. Is that the one where the people are like planting something in the
exactly in
cover?
the
Yeah, yeah,
cover
yeah.
on it's community organizations, non-governmental groups that are working in the recuperation of Puerto Rico, their communities, their their localities, etc. That was the last one, but we're having one recent that is in the works on the ecology of Puerto Rico, environmental justice, and that's
That's
very
big right
much.
now. Is that coming? Is that the next one coming up? Environmental
No, it
justice,
will
or
come up a little bit later.
what's the
Uh,
next one?
the next one is it's also on narratives of survival after Maria.
Okay.
So it's in a way that, but this one on the ecology, we have another one coming up on which is interesting on corruption in Puerto Rico.
Well, you're gonna
And
have
we
to devote. You're gonna have to devote the year's production to that one. That's gonna be like a 3-volume one.
we have gotten a lot of papers coming in, like 20 something, which is interesting. And then recently, 2 academics, Tania Carrasquillo Hernandez, who's at Linfield University in Oregon, and Diana Aramburu, who's at UC Davis, both literature persons, write to me about there's a big problem in Puerto Rico and in the diaspora and in the world on feminicide and gender violence. And they write to me and say, why don't we do you know, will you support us in a special issue on feminicide and gender violence? I said, sure, absolutely. You know, this is something that we have to get it out. We have to put it out and educate. You know,
that's another three issue. That's another three issue
Miguel
topic.
And neither Diana nor Tanya nor myself thought that we were going to get so many proposals. We got like 25 proposals. Amazing. Some of them monumentally interesting.
Wow.
From people telling their own stories to academic studies of violence and feminicide, to organizations, studies of organizations that help battered women, to analysis of literature and the issue of gender violence. Amazing. I mean, and it's sort of like refreshes, such a sad topic, but it refreshes you and gives you hope that there are people out there who want to tackle these big time issues: corruption, environmental justice, gender violence and feminicide, you know. And so
no, I mean, those three issues are powerful. I mean, not most of the issues are powerful, but some have more specific interest groups, and these all seem to be very broad, very much 21st century issues. And even though you're looking at them through the prism of Puerto Rico, as that is the mission, they are really, I mean, the corruption is wrecking this country and the world, and the whole ecology thing seems to be the...
Yeah, they're universal. And what we're doing, and many other articles do, is that they connect Puerto Rico, the diaspora, to currents in the world where this is happening. It's so that's sort of like, and I think that came out of the pandemic in a way, that people think more and more aware of these things.
And so that's again a positive, one positive, as I like to end on a positive note. And going forward, what do you think? I mean, it's worthless now to make any predictions, because every time the goalpost keeps moving. Remember, this was going to be a week or a couple of weeks or a month.
Spring was going to kill it.
Yes, but I don't know. What do you see? La última palabra para Totti, and we're going to say goodbye after that. What do you see?
I think that Puerto Rican studies and Latino studies are alive and kicking, and yeah, there are threats to it, but by the same token, you know, we have our stories to tell, and we are telling them and want to continue to tell them. So yes, we're being threatened by all the powers that be out there who want to squash us, but aquí estamos y we're going to continue.
Adelante. Thank you, Totti. Good evening. Buenas noches.
Thank you, Miguel. It was a pleasure.